Miss Marple and Lady Bantry's Christmas Market Murder. Welcome to Cafe Tales. I'm Allie, your host, and I'm delighted you've joined us tonight. These mysteries have a wonderful way of bringing us all together, no matter where in the world we are. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from. I always enjoy reading your notes. Don't forget to subscribe as we bring you new Miss Marple stories every single day. Now settle in with your tea or coffee, get cozy, and let's begin tonight's mystery. Chapter 1. Frost and Fairy Lights. The first frost of December had touched St. Mary Mead with its crystalline fingers, transforming the village green into something that might have graced a Christmas card. Miss Jane Marple, wrapped in her warmest coat and armed with a basket of knitted goods, picked her way carefully across the frozen grass toward the bustling preparations for the annual Christmas market. Already the green was blooming with wooden stalls, their canvas awnings fluttering in the crisp morning air. Fairy lights wound themselves around every post and beam like glittering serpents, though they would not truly come to life until evening fell. The scent of sawdust and fresh pine mingled with the promising aromas drifting from the food stalls, where enterprising villagers were already testing their mulled wine and minced pies. At the far end of the green, where Gossington Hall's imposing gates opened onto the forecourt, the grandest preparations were taking place. Mrs. Dolly Bantry, resplendent in a fur-trimmed coat that had seen better decades but retained its dignity, supervised the arrangement of the raffle prizes with the enthusiasm of a general planning a campaign. "Jane, my dear," she called, waving enthusiastically as Miss Marple approached. "How perfectly splendid to see you. I do hope you've brought those divine mittens you mentioned. Mrs. Pemberton from Little Wickham is coming especially to see your handiwork." Miss Marple smiled and patted her basket. "Indeed I have, Dolly, though I must say you've outdone yourself this year. The green looks absolutely magical." "Doesn't it just?" Mrs. Bantry's eyes sparkled with genuine pleasure. "Arthur grumbles, of course, about the trampling of his precious lawn, but even he admits it's rather special. And wait until you see our counting hut." She gestured toward what had once been a modest potting shed, now transformed with red bunting and a cheerful sign reading raffle and accounts. The little building sat snugly between two larger stalls, its single window already fogged with condensation from the small brazier that had been installed to keep the money counters warm. "Very cozy," Miss Marple observed, "though I do hope it's properly ventilated. One can't be too careful with braziers." "Oh, Hugh Denby saw to all that," Mrs. Bantry replied. "He's our electrical wizard this year. X-ray, you know, terribly clever with generators and such things. He's already tested everything twice." This morning, Asif summoned by her words, a compact man in working clothes emerged from behind the main generator, coiling electrical cables with practiced efficiency. His movements were economical and precise, and Miss Marple noticed he handled not only cables, but also what appeared to be rubber tubing with the same methodical care. "For a lantern, ma'am," he explained when she inquired politely. "Emergency lighting should the main generator fail. Can't have the market in darkness, can we?" Hugh Denby had the weathered look of a man who had seen action, his graying hair cropped, short, and his hands bearing the permanent stains of honest work. When he spoke, it was with the clipped efficiency of someone accustomed to following orders and giving them an equal measure. "Mr. Denby has been invaluable," Mrs. Bantry confided, as they moved away, "though he does fret about the petrol quality. Modern stuff, he says, not what it was in his day." The morning progressed with the familiar choreography of village preparation. Miss Marple found herself stationed at the knitted goods stall, where she could observe the comings and goings while, apparently absorbed in arranging woolly scarves and mittens to their best advantage, she watched as Inspector Slack arrived, looking somewhat out of place in his official capacity, but clearly enjoying the festive atmosphere. Dr. Haydock made his rounds, checking that all was well, and accepting the inevitable cup of tea from whoever happened to be brewing. The Reverend Leonard Clement and his wife appeared punctually at 10, she bearing a tray of her famous shortbread, he carrying a stack of carol sheets for the evening's entertainment. At the stationery stall, Mabel Finch was busy with her printing press, turning out raffle tickets with the dedication of a master craftsman. The tickets emerged in neat strips, numbered sequentially, and Miss Marple noted how carefully Mabel accounted for each one in her ledger. "Can't have any irregularities," Mabel explained when Miss Marple complimented her thoroughness. "Mrs. Rowe would never forgive me if the accounts didn't balance to the penny." Mrs. Rowe herself was indeed a formidable figure, armed with ledgers, and equipped with the sort of organizational skills that had made the Women's Institute a force to be reckoned with. She moved between stalls with military precision, ensuring that every transaction would be properly recorded. Near the haberdashery stall, Miss Marple encountered B. Lutal, arranging ribbons and trimmings with an artist's eye for color and texture. B's red ribbons were particularly fine, stiffened with shellac to hold their shape, and bright as holly berries against the white tablecloth. "For the Christmas decorations," she explained, holding up a length of scarlet silk. "Though I dare say they'll find their way onto packages and such before the evening's out." The morning's most theatrical arrival was undoubtedly Toby Price, the amateur magician who had been engaged to play Father Christmas for the children's grotto. He appeared in full costume, his beard magnificently white, and already acquiring a dusting of the glittery artificial snow that decorated his domain. "Ho, ho, ho!" he boomed experimentally, causing several small children to squeal with delight and hide behind their mother's skirts. "Just testing the vocal cords, you understand?" "Can't disappoint the little ones." Miss Marple smiled at his enthusiasm. There was something endearing about a grown man taking such obvious pleasure in bringing joy to children, even if his beard was rather obviously artificial, and his red suit had seen service in several previous Christmas seasons. The shadow that would soon fall across the festivities arrived shortly after noon in the form of Mr. Crispin Vale. He swept onto the green with the air of a man accustomed to being noticed and approved of. His expensive overcoat immaculate despite the morning's frost, his walking stick tapping importantly on the frozen ground. Vale was not well liked in St. Mary Mead, a fact that became immediately apparent from the way conversations died as he approached, and resumed only after he had passed. His interest in purchasing a strip of Gossington Hall's grounds was well known, as was his habit of using his wealth as a tool to achieve his ends. "Mrs. Bantry," he called, his voice carrying across the green, with theatrical projection. "How absolutely charming everything looks. I trust my little contribution will be put to good use." Mrs. Bantry's smile became somewhat fixed. "Most generous, Mr. Vale. The hospital fund will benefit enormously." "Indeed it will," Vale replied, his chest swelling with self-importance. "In fact, I have a proposition that will double our success. I pledge to match tonight's takings, pound for pound, provided they are properly counted and accounted for. Transparency and charity, you understand. Most important." He made this announcement loudly enough for half the green to hear, and Miss Marple observed the various reactions with interest. Mrs. Rowe looked gratified at the implied confidence in her accounting, while Inspector Slack raised an eyebrow at what might have been taken as criticism of the arrangements. Hugh Denby, adjusting something on the generator, scowled and muttered under his breath about people who had more money than sense. "Very generous, indeed," Mrs. Bantry managed, though her tone suggested she found Vale's conditions somewhat presumptuous. As the afternoon wore on and the stallholders made their final preparations, Miss Marple continued her quiet observations. She noticed how Hugh Denby tested the generator, not once but twice, grumbling about the quality of the modern petrol and the unreliability of wartime surplus equipment. She saw how carefully he coiled his electrical cables and how he handled the rubber tubing with the same methodical precision. The fairy lights flickered to life as dusk approached, transforming the green into something magical and ethereal. Children pressed their noses against sweet shop windows made of canvas and dreams, while their parents gathered in small groups, stamping their feet against the cold and looking forward to the evening's entertainment. In the counting hut, the little brazier glowed cheerfully, its warmth already beginning to fog the single window. Mrs. Bantry had hung bunting around the door and placed a small sign reminding people that all proceeds would benefit the local hospital fund. "Everything ready?" then Colonel Bantry inquired, appearing at his wife's elbow with the resigned air of a man who had learned not to question the elaborate social machinery his wife set in motion. "Absolutely everything, Arthur," she replied, beaming with satisfaction. "What could possibly go wrong?" Miss Marple, folding the last of her mittens into their display basket, reflected that in her experience, such confident pronouncements often proved to be what her nephew Raymond would call famous last words. The evening stretched ahead, full of promise and the scent of mulled wine, the sound of carols, and the warm glow of fairy lights against the December darkness. In a few hours the counting would begin, the raffle would be drawn, and the village would celebrate another successful Christmas market. What none of them could have imagined was that before the evening was over, the cheerful counting hut would become the scene of something far more sinister than mathematical errors, and that the fairy lights would illuminate not just celebration, but the first threads of a most peculiar and deadly puzzle. Chapter 2. The Counting Hut 7:30. That evening, the Christmas market had achieved that perfect pitch of festivity that comes only when all the elements align. The fairy lights twinkled like earthbound stars, the mulled wine sent its spiced warmth into the frosty air, and the sound of carols drifted across the green from where the village choir had gathered near the memorial cross. Miss Marple, having successfully sold the last of her mittens to a delighted grandmother from Much Benham, found herself with the pleasant freedom to observe the evening's proceedings. She accepted a cup of Mrs. Clement's excellent mulled wine and positioned herself where she could watch the final preparations for the grand raffle draw. The counting hut glowed invitingly, its single window casting a warm rectangle of light onto the frost-covered grass. Inside, she could see Mrs. Rowe arranging her ledgers and counting equipment, with a methodical precision that had made her the treasurer of choice for every village organization worth its salt. The little brazier in the corner provided a cheerful counterpoint to the evening's chill, though Miss Marple noticed that the window had been cracked open slightly for ventilation. At precisely 7:40, as the choir launched into their first proper carol of the evening, Crispin Vale made his entrance to the counting hut with characteristic theatrical flair. He had been holding court near the raffle table, regaling anyone who would listen with stories of his business acumen and charitable nature. But now he strode purposefully toward the little building. "Time to see about those takings," he announced loudly enough for several nearby stall holders to hear. "Transparency, you know, most important in charitable endeavors." Mrs. Rowe looked up from her ledgers with a slight frown. She was not accustomed to having her methods questioned, even indirectly, and Vale's implications of irregularity sat poorly with her orderly mind. "The accounts are perfectly in order, Mr. Vale," she said crisply. "They always are." "I'm quite certain they are," Vala replied with the sort of smile that managed to be both ingratiating and patronizing. "But as I'm matching the evening's takings, I thought I might warm myself by your excellent brazier, and perhaps observe the counting process. Educational, you might say." Mrs. Rowe's lips compressed into a thin line, but good manners and the importance of Vale's promised contribution made objection impossible. "Very well, though I shall need to step out momentarily to fetch change from Miss Finch's stall. The choir is starting, and there may be last-minute ticket purchases." Of course," Vale agreed genially, settling himself into the chair beside the counting table. "I'll keep your ledgers company." Miss Marple watched this exchange with interest, noting the way Mrs. Rowe's shoulders stiffened as she gathered her coat and prepared to leave Vale alone with the evening's takings. The choir's voices rose in harmony, the familiar words carrying clearly across the frosty air, and their melody provided a pleasant backdrop to the market's continuing activities. The next 10 minutes passed peacefully enough. Miss Marple observed the various comings and goings around the green, the children queuing at Toby Price's grotto, the steady stream of visitors sampling wares and purchasing last-minute Christmas gifts. Hugh Denby moved efficiently between his electrical installations, checking connections and adjusting the generator with mechanical precision that spoke of long experience. It was Inspector Slack who first noticed something amiss. He had been making his rounds in the genial manner of a policeman at a village celebration, accepting compliments on the organization and keeping a professional eye on the proceedings. When he approached the counting hut just after 7:50, intending to check on the security of the evening's takings, he found the door closed and no response to his polite knock. "Mrs. Rowe," he called, tapping again more firmly. "Everything all right in there?" When silence continued to greet his inquiries, Slack tried the simple swivel latch and found it unlocked. The door opened easily, and what he saw inside brought him up short. Crispin Vale sat slumped in the chair beside the counting table, his head tilted at an unnatural angle, his face bearing an oddly rosy flush that was somehow more unsettling than pallor might have been. His lips, Miss Marple noticed when Slack's exclamation brought her hurrying over, were unusually bright, as though touched with color. "Mrs. Bantry," Slack called sharply. "Could you come here, please? And someone fetch Dr. Haydock immediately. Mrs. Bantry arrived with commendable speed, took one look at the scene, and went quite pale herself. "Oh, my dear goodness," she breathed. "Is he—" "I'm afraid so," Slack confirmed grimly. "Though what's to be done for him, I couldn't say." Dr. Haydock arrived within minutes, summoned from the mulled wine stall, where he had been enjoying a professional discussion with the Reverend Clement about the beneficial properties of cinnamon. His examination was swift but thorough, his weathered face growing increasingly puzzled as he worked. "Well?" Slack inquired when the doctor finally straightened. "Difficult to say with certainty," Haydock replied, frowning. "No obvious wounds, no scent of poison that I can detect. Could be heart failure brought on by the excitement and cold. Could be gas from that brazier, though it seems to have gone cold." Miss Marple, who had been quietly observing from the doorway, stepped carefully into the small space. The takings bag lay open on the table, its contents apparently undisturbed. The ledger was open to the current day's entries, though she noticed a smudge of what appeared to be mulled wine on the page along with a tiny fleck of ash. "The window's been opened," she observed mildly. "For ventilation, no doubt." "Sensible precaution," Haydock agreed, though if it was gas from the brazier, the fresh air would have cleared it by now. Miss Marple moved toward the small louver vent high on the back wall of the hut. When she touched the slats gently, she found them surprisingly warm, despite the evening's chill. More interesting still was what she discovered outside. "How curious," she murmured, stepping back into the cold air to examine the exterior wall. "There's a holly wreath wired to the vent, most decorative." Mrs. Bantry, who'd been hovering anxiously nearby, looked confused. "A wreath? But there wasn't one there earlier. I'm quite certain of it. I walked past that very spot when we were arranging the bunting this afternoon." "You're quite right, Dolly," Miss Marple agreed thoughtfully. "It wasn't there an hour ago when I passed by. Someone has been busy with their Christmas decorating." Inspector Slack, meanwhile, had been examining the scene with professional thoroughness. The simple swivel latch showed no signs of tampering, and nothing appeared to have been disturbed beyond Vale's own tragic presence. The brazier in the corner had indeed gone cold, its coals reduced to gray ash that gave off no heat. "Where's Mrs. Rowe got to?" he inquired, looking around the gathering crowd. "Here, Inspector," came a breathless voice, and Mrs. Rowe pushed through the small group of onlookers. Her face was flushed with cold and exertion, and her hands showed the telltale stains of ink from handling tickets and ledger entries. "I was at Miss Finch's stall just as I said," she explained quickly, "getting change for the last-minute sales. The choir had started their first proper carol, and I knew there would be people wanting tickets. I couldn't have been gone more than a few minutes." And Mr. Vale was alive when you left him? Slack asked. Oh, yes, certainly. Quite comfortable he seemed, warming his hands by the brazier and looking through the ledger. He said he was impressed by the organization. Mrs. Rowe's voice wavered slightly. I never imagined. Oh, the poor man. Miss Marple continued her gentle examination of the scene, her keen eyes taking in details that others might miss. The smudge on the ledger page intrigued her particularly, as did the small ash fleck. The timing, too, was interesting. Mrs. Rowe had left during the choir's opening carol, which had provided convenient cover for any number of activities around the green. The generator has been running smoothly all evening, she inquired of Hugh Denby, who had appeared at the edge of the crowd with the rest of the market's organizers. Perfectly, Denby replied curtly. Tested it twice this morning, just to be certain. Though I still say the petrol is not what it should be. Modern stuff burns differently than what we had in the service. As the crowd began to disperse at Inspector Slack's firm request, Miss Marple took one last look at the counting hut. Something about the scene troubled her, though she couldn't quite put her finger on what it was. The rosy color of Vale's complexion, the brightness of his lips, the curious warmth of the louver vent, and most particularly the holly wreath that had appeared so mysteriously during the brief window when the counting hut had been unobserved. A most peculiar business, she murmured to herself as she walked slowly back toward the fairy-lit stalls. Behind her, Inspector Slack was beginning the process of securing the scene and gathering statements, while Dr. Haydock made arrangements for the removal of Crispin Vale's body. The Christmas market would continue, but the shadow of death had fallen across the festive evening, and Miss Marple found herself wondering what other secrets the fairy lights might illuminate before the night was through. The carol singers, unaware of the tragedy that had unfolded during their performance, launched into their second song of the evening, their voices carrying clearly across the frosty air. But for Miss Marple, their harmony seemed to carry an undertone of something darker. A reminder that even in the most innocent of settings, human nature could take its most sinister turns. The morning after the Chapter 3, 2, Father Christmas's Christmas Market brought with it a peculiar atmosphere to St. Mary Mead. The fairy lights had been extinguished, the stalls dismantled, but the shadow of Crispin Vale's unexpected death lingered over the village like morning mist that refused to lift. Inspector Slack had established himself in the village hall, methodically interviewing anyone who might have witnessed something significant during those crucial minutes when Vale had met his end. Miss Marple, having offered her services in organizing tea for the various witnesses, found herself in the enviable position of overhearing a great deal of interesting conversation. It was during one of these tea-serving expeditions that she first heard about the puzzling matter of the two Father Christmases. Little Tommy Fletcher, age 7 and possessed of the sharp observational skills that children often display when adults least expect it, was quite insistent on the point. There were 2 of them, miss, he declared firmly to Inspector Slack, his small face serious with the importance of giving evidence. One in the grotto with the presents and another one by the big, noisy machine. I saw them both. His sister Emma, 2 years older and therefore infinitely more sophisticated, nodded in vigorous agreement. Tommy's right, Inspector. The grotto Father Christmas had sparkles all over his beard from the pretend snow, but the other one didn't have sparkles. His beard was different too, not so white. Inspector Slack, who had dealt with enough child witnesses to know they could be remarkably accurate about details that adults might miss, made careful notes. And where exactly did you see this second Father Christmas? By the generator, Tommy replied promptly. He was doing something with the lights. Mama said we mustn't go too close because of the electricity. He was fixing the lights, Emma added helpfully. Had his back to us mostly, but we could see the red coat and the beard. He had side cuffs, though, which seemed odd for Father Christmas. When Toby Price was summoned to give his account, he was genuinely bewildered by the children's testimony. Still wearing his theatrical beard, though now somewhat disheveled from the previous evening's activities, he faced Inspector Slack with obvious confusion. But I never left the grotto, Inspector, he protested earnestly. Not once the children started. Queuing. There were dozens of them throughout the evening, and I pride myself on giving each child proper attention. Mrs. Henderson can vouch for me. She was helping organize the queue. Indeed, Mrs. Henderson confirmed that Mr. Price had remained steadfastly at his post from 6 until well past 8, when the tragic discovery in the counting hut had brought the evening's festivities to an abrupt halt. Never moved from his chair, she stated firmly. Very dedicated he was, though I must say his beard did get rather matted with that artificial snow they use in the grotto. Miss Marple examined Toby's beard with interest and found it exactly as described, heavy with glittery particles that clung to the artificial hair with stubborn determination. Most authentic, she observed kindly. The children must have been delighted. It was B. Lutul who provided the next piece of the puzzle. When Inspector Slack interviewed her about the evening's events, she mentioned an encounter that had seemed innocent enough at the time, but now took on a more sinister significance. Someone dressed as Father Christmas did approach my stall, she admitted, her usually confident manner somewhat shaken. Asked for a red ribbon, he did. Said he needed it to tie bunting by the shed. I gave him a yard of my best scarlet silk, the kind stiffened with shellac. Seemed a reasonable request at the time. Can you describe this person? Slack inquired. Well, he was wearing the full costume, beard and all, but now that I think about it, the beard didn't look quite right. Not as full as Mr. Price's, and the voice was different too. Gruffer, somehow. She frowned, clearly disturbed by the memory. I assumed it was someone helping with the decorations. There were so many people about. Hugh Denby, when questioned about this mysterious second Santa, was emphatic in his denials, his weathered face darkened with indignation at the suggestion. I never wore any costume, he stated flatly. Spent the whole evening tending to the electrical systems just as I was supposed to. Those generators need constant monitoring, especially with the cheap petrol we're forced to use these days. However, Inspector Slack's attention was drawn to certain practical considerations that Denby's protestations couldn't entirely address. There was, for instance, the matter of Colonel Bantry's motor car, which had been parked conveniently near the main cable trunk that supplied power to the southern string of lights. This detail became significant when Mrs. Peaton from Little Wickham mentioned somewhat reluctantly that she had overheard a heated discussion between Colonel Bantry and Crispin Vale earlier in the day. I didn't mean to eavesdrop, she explained, apologetically, but they were speaking quite loudly near the tea stall. Something about land prices and unreasonable demands. Colonel Bantry seemed quite put out. When Colonel Bantry himself was questioned about this exchange, he admitted to the conversation with obvious reluctance. Vale was pressing his suit about. That strip of land again, he said gruffly, making all sorts of promises about development potential and increased property values. Frankly, the man wouldn't take no for an answer. And you argued with him about it? Slack pressed. I wouldn't call it arguing exactly, but I did tell him in no uncertain terms that Gossington's grounds aren't for sale, not to him or anyone else. Colonel Bantry's mustache bristled with indignation. Been in the family for generations, not about to parcel it off to the highest bidder. Miss Marple, listening to these various accounts while refilling teacups and offering biscuits, found herself increasingly intrigued by the practical details of the mystery. The children's testimony about two Father Christmases seemed remarkably consistent despite their youth. Tommy Fletcher's observation about the SI cuffs was particularly interesting, as was Emma's note about the different quality of the second Santa's beard. It was Inspector Slack who made the connection to the costume situation. A thorough search of the market storage area revealed that the Father Christmas outfit had been provided by the Village Dramatic Society, complete with spare accessories in case of mishaps. Behind the makeshift stage area, Slack discovered the costume bag that contained the hired Santa suit. Inside, alongside the expected items, was a second beard and an extra pair of cuffs. Most tellingly, one of the cuffs bore a distinct ring of soot, and the entire bag carried the faint but unmistakable scent of petrol. Now that's interesting, Miss Marple observed when Slack showed her these discoveries. Aspear costume suggests someone planned to impersonate Father Christmas, but the soot and petrol smell suggests they were engaged in rather more practical activities than distributing presents. The evidence was mounting for a deliberate deception, but the motive remained unclear. Why would someone go to the trouble of disguising themselves as Father Christmas? And what connection could this masquerade have with Crispin Vale's death in the counting hut? Miss Marple considered these questions as she walked slowly around the now empty green. The fairy lights had been taken down, but their brackets remained, and she could trace the path of the electrical cables that had brought the market to life. The generator sat silent now, its exhaust pipe pointing toward where the counting hut had stood, and she found herself wondering about the practical knowledge required to manage such equipment. Someone had been very clever, she reflected. Clever enough to create an alibi through misdirection, using the children's natural attention to Father Christmas as a way of establishing a false timeline. But cleverness, as she had learned through long experience, often carried within it the seeds of its own destruction. The question now was whether Inspector Slack would be able to piece together the evidence before the trail grew cold, or whether this Christmas mystery would require her own particular brand of gentle but persistent inquiry to unravel its secrets. The second day of the investigation. Chapter 4. Mulled wine ledger brought with it a more detailed examination of the physical evidence from the counting hut, and it was Mrs. Bantry who first drew attention to the peculiarities of the ledger that had been open on the table when Crispin Vale's body was discovered. "I simply cannot understand it," she confided to Miss Marple over morning coffee in the drawing room at Gossington Hall. "Mrs. Rowe is meticulous about her record-keeping, absolutely meticulous. But there's that dreadful smudge right across the evenings. Figures. And Inspector Slack says it appears to have been made around the time of poor Mr. Vale's death." Miss Marple accepted her cup thoughtfully. A smudge of mulled wine, wasn't it? Most unfortunate considering the importance of accurate accounts. Exactly. And Mrs. Rowe is quite beside herself about it. She keeps insisting that her hands were perfectly clean when she left the hut, and that she hadn't been drinking anything while working on the books. Mrs. Bantry stirred her coffee with unusual agitation. The poor dear feels as though her professional competence is being questioned. When Inspector Slack visited Gossington Hall later that morning to take a more detailed statement from Colonel Bantry, he brought with him the ledger in question. The smudge was indeed prominent, a reddish-brown stain that had partially obscured what appeared to be a figure entered at 7:45. Mrs. Rowe confirmed she had no mulled wine with her in the hut, Slack explained. Claims her hands were ink-stained but otherwise clean when she stepped out to fetch change from Miss Finch's stall. Miss Marple examined the ledger with interest, noting not only the wine stain, but also the tiny fleck of ash that had been embedded in the still wet ink. More intriguing still was a faint impression in the paper itself, as though something had been laid across the page before the ink had completely dried. "How curious," she murmured, running her finger gently along the mark. "It appears as though a cord or string of some kind was placed across the ledger. You can see the slight depression in the paper." "String?" Slack frowned. "What sort of string?" "Bunting cord, perhaps. The kind used for decorating the stalls." Miss Marple's eyes held that particular gleam that those who knew her well had learned to recognize, though why anyone would lay bunting cord across an open ledger is quite beyond me. The question of timing became more complex when they spoke with Mrs. Rowe herself. The treasurer was clearly distressed by the implications surrounding her careful record-keeping, but her account of the evening's events remained consistent with her earlier statements. "I left Mr. Vale warming himself by the brazier at exactly 7:40, she stated firmly. The choir had just begun their first proper carol, Personant Hodie, and I knew from experience that people always want to buy last-minute tickets when the singing starts. It makes them feel festive." "And you went directly to Miss Finch's stall?" Slack inquired. "Indeed, I did. Needed change for the larger denominations, and Mabel always keeps a good supply of coins in her cash box." Mrs. Rowe's voice wavered slightly. I was only gone a few minutes, Inspector. Surely nothing could have happened in so short a time. It was this visit to Mabel Finch that provided the next piece of the puzzle. When Slack examined Mabel's ticket rolls and cash records, he discovered an irregularity that the meticulous stationer found deeply embarrassing. I don't understand. It myself, Mabel confessed, her usually precise manner somewhat flustered. There are 2 gaps in the numbering sequence, tickets that were sold after I had officially closed the sales. The numbers don't match my records, and I have no memory of the transactions. She produced the ticket roll in question, and indeed there were 2 numbers missing from what should have been a continuous sequence. The stubs that should have remained in her possession were gone, leaving only blank spaces where they should have been. Someone came for last-minute tickets, Slack suggested. Well, yes, but that's the peculiar thing. I do remember a gentleman in a soft hat asking for tickets just as Mrs. Rowe arrived, but I only sold him 1 ticket, not 2, and I'm certain I gave him a number from the proper sequence. Mabel's brow furrowed with concentration. Though now that I think about it, he did seem to know exactly which numbers he wanted. Most people just take whatever ticket comes next. Miss Marple found this detail particularly intriguing. A gentleman in a soft hat. Could you describe him further? Rather indistinct, I'm afraid. The lighting wasn't very good near my stall, and he kept his head down while counting out his money. But his hands were quite distinctive now that I think about it. Working hands with what looked like chalk dust on the fingers. The matter of the mulled wine itself proved equally mysterious when they investigated its source. Mrs. Henderson, who had been managing the refreshment stall, confirmed that her mulled wine was indeed heavily spiced with cinnamon, which would account for the reddish-brown color of the stain on the ledger. Lovely and warming it was, she said proudly. Secret is in the cinnamon, I always say. People came back for seconds all evening long, but when Miss Marple asked if she might taste a sample from the remaining supply, she found something interesting about the flavor profile. Quite delicious, she observed to Inspector Slack afterward, but unusually heavy on the cinnamon, even for Mrs. Henderson's generous hand, almost as though someone had added extra spice to mask another flavor entirely. The afternoon brought a more systematic search of the market area, now cleared of its festive decorations, but still bearing traces of the evening's activities. It was during this search that Slack made a discovery that shed new light on the mysterious bunting cord impression in the ledger. Near the generator, partially hidden beneath the coiled electrical cables that Hugh Denby had stored so methodically, they found a length of red bunting cord. One end showed clear signs of having been cut recently, while the other end bore traces of what appeared to be the same reddish-brown stain that had marked the ledger. Now that's interesting, Miss Marple observed, examining the cord carefully. It appears to have been used to measure something, or perhaps to guide something into position. Guide what? Slack asked. That, Inspector, is precisely the question, isn't it? Miss Marple smiled gently. Though I suspect the answer lies in understanding why someone would need to lay a measuring cord across Mrs. Rowe's ledger, and what they were measuring so carefully. The pattern that was emerging suggested a level of premeditation that transformed the case from a possible accident or crime of passion into something far more calculated. The missing ticket numbers, the chalk-stained fingers, the bunting cord, with its tellingly stained end, and the smudged ledger entry all pointed to someone who had planned their actions with considerable care. Yet questions remained. Why would the murderer risk entering the counting hut while Mrs. Rowe was absent for such a brief period? What role did the mulled wine play in the evening's events? And most puzzling of all, what was the significance of the precise timing that seemed to be so important to whoever had orchestrated Vale's death? Miss Marple walked slowly home through the village as evening fell, her mind turning over these various pieces of evidence like a jeweler examining facets of a complex gem. Somewhere in the tangle of tickets and timing, chalk dust, and bunting cord lay the solution to a most carefully planned murder. The fairy lights were dark now, but in her mind's eye she could see them again, as they had been that night, twinkling cheerfully, while beneath their innocent glow, someone had used the cover of carols and celebration to commit a most ingenious crime. What she needed now was to understand not just how it had been done, but why the killer had felt compelled to go to such elaborate lengths to achieve their deadly purpose. Chapter 5. The wreath on the vent investigation dawned crisp and clear, with that particular quality of winter light that makes even the most familiar objects appear somehow transformed. Miss Marple, having spent a restless night considering the various threads of evidence, decided that a return visit to the scene was in order. There was something about the holly wreath that had appeared so mysteriously on the counting hut's vent that continued to trouble her quiet mind. She found Inspector Slack already there, examining the dismantled hut with the methodical thoroughness that marked his professional approach. The little building had been moved aside to allow for a more complete investigation of the ground beneath, and what they discovered proved most illuminating. "Found something interesting, Miss Marple," Slack announced as she approached. "Take a look at this." The area where the hut had stood showed clear evidence of disturbance. There were scuff marks in the frost-hardened earth and what appeared to be a shallow groove running from the approximate position of the vent toward the area where the generator had been stationed, as though something had been dragged across the ground, Miss Marple observed thoughtfully. Or perhaps laid down and then removed. "That's what I thought too," Slack agreed. "And there's this." He indicated a small pile of white chalk dust near where the groove ended. The chalk was of the type used by tradesmen for marking measurements, and Miss Marple recognized it immediately as similar to what Mabel Finch had described on the fingers of her mysterious late customer. Mr. Denby mentioned using chalk to mark cable lengths, she recalled, a practical man's tool for ensuring accurate measurements. They turned their attention to the holly wreath itself, which had been carefully removed and preserved as evidence. The wreath was expertly made with glossy holly leaves arranged in a perfect circle and secured with wire that showed the distinctive twist pattern of someone accustomed to electrical work. "The wire has been twisted left to right," Miss Marple noted, examining the construction closely. "That's rather interesting, don't you think?" "Mean something to you?" Slack inquired. "Perhaps it might indicate the handedness of whoever made it, or simply a habit developed through professional training." Miss Marple continued her examination of the wreath. "But more interesting still is the resin on some of these wire ends, fresh holly resin, as though the branches were cut and wired very recently." Inside that dismantled vent, they discovered traces that proved even more significant. A thin film of soot coated the interior surface. Despite the fact that no fire or heating source had been installed in that location, more telling still was a damp ring on the metal surface, as though something wet or condensation-producing had been present. Gas fumes would leave exactly such traces, Miss Marple observed quietly, particularly if they had been directed through the vent from an external source. External source? Slack frowned. "What sort of external source?" Miss Marple didn't answer immediately. Instead, she walked slowly toward the area where the generator had been positioned, following the shallow groove they had discovered. The path led directly from the vent to a spot where the bunting had concealed the generator's exhaust pipe from casual observation. In Hugh Denby's cable storage crate, they found what they were looking for: a length of rubber tubing coiled with the same methodical precision that marked all of Denby's equipment organization. One end of the tube showed clear signs of heat exposure with a smoky discoloration that spoke of contact with exhaust fumes. "Now that's very interesting indeed," Miss Marple murmured, examining the tubing carefully. "This appears to have been used as a conduit of some sort. And see here, Inspector, how one end fits perfectly over a standard exhaust pipe fitting." Slack was beginning to understand the implications. "You're suggesting someone use this tubing to direct exhaust fumes from the generator into the counting hut. It would explain a great deal, wouldn't it? The soot in the vent, the damp ring, the curious warmth I noticed when I first examined the louver slats." Miss Marple's voice carried that gentle tone that those familiar with her methods had learned to recognize as indicating a significant breakthrough. They examined the generator itself, though it had been moved from its original position. However, the ground where it had stood showed clear indentations that matched the equipment's base, and more importantly, the positioning would have allowed its exhaust pipe to point directly toward the counting hut. The distance would require quite a length of tubing, Slack calculated, pacing between the two locations. Indeed, it would. But Mr. Denby, being an experienced mechanic, would certainly have access to whatever length was needed. Miss Marple paused thoughtfully. And the bunting would have provided excellent concealment for such a arrangement, particularly in the evening light. The holly wreath took on new significance when viewed as part of this larger scheme. Rather than mere festive decoration, it became a crucial component in concealing the entry point for what must have been a carefully planned method of introducing carbon monoxide into the confined space of the counting hut. But the timing would have to be precise, Slack mused. Someone would need to know exactly when Vale would be alone in the hut, and for how long. Precisely, Inspector, which brings us back to those missing minutes when Mrs. Rowe stepped out to fetch change from Miss Finch's stall. Miss Marple considered this carefully. Someone who knew the routines of the market, who understood that the choir's opening carol would create the perfect distraction, and who had the technical knowledge to rig such an arrangement. They found additional evidence of the plan's sophistication when they examined the ground more closely. The chalk dust wasn't randomly scattered, but formed a deliberate pattern, as though someone had used it to mark specific measurements or positions. Whoever did this planned it very carefully indeed, Miss Marple observed. The chalk marks suggest they measured the exact positioning needed for their tubing arrangement. The groove shows where it was laid, and the scuff marks indicate it was subsequently removed and concealed. But when would they have had the opportunity to set all this up? Slack wondered. Miss Marple smiled gently. That, Inspector, is where the matter of the two Father Christmases becomes so very significant. A man in a red suit working near the generator during the evening's festivities would have attracted little attention. Children expect to see Father Christmas everywhere during such celebrations. The picture that was emerging showed a level of premeditation that was both impressive and chilling. Someone had used their technical knowledge, their understanding of the market's routines, and the festive atmosphere itself to create an almost perfect murder method. Yet perfection, as Miss Marple well knew, often contained within it the seeds of detection. The very sophistication of the plan had required leaving traces that a careful investigation could uncover. The holly wreath meant to conceal evidence had instead become evidence itself. The chalk marks, the rubber tubing, the carefully timed execution of the scheme all pointed towards someone with very specific knowledge and capabilities. As they walked back toward the village, Miss Marple found herself considering not just the how of the murder, but the why. What had driven someone to go to such elaborate lengths to kill Crispin Vale? The answer, she suspected, lay in understanding what Vale had discovered about his killer, and why that discovery had made him so dangerous that only death could silence him. Chapter 6. Chalk on the purse third day brought Inspector Slack back to the counting hut's contents with renewed purpose. The discovery of the exhaust tube arrangement had cast the physical evidence in an entirely new light, and he was determined to examine every item that had been in the hut during those fatal minutes. Miss Marple accompanied him to the village hall, where the contents had been carefully catalogued and stored. Among the items was the leather money purse that had contained the evening's takings, and it was this seemingly innocent object that provided the next crucial piece of evidence. "Look at this," Miss Marple Slack said, holding the purse up to the light from the hall's tall windows. "There's a clear thumbprint on the clasp, but it's not made by ink or natural oils." Miss Marple examined the mark with a characteristic thoroughness. The print was indeed distinct, but its white coloration immediately identified its source. "Chalk dust," she observed quietly. "The same type we found near the generator site. Someone with chalky fingers handled this purse, and quite recently, too, judging by the clarity of the impression. Mrs. Rowe's hands were ink-stained when we questioned her, but she showed no traces of chalk, Slack recalled. She was quite particular about keeping her hands clean for the money handling. This observation led them to request a meeting with Hugh Denby, who arrived at the village hall with obvious reluctance. His weathered hands, when examined, showed the telltale signs of his trade: ingrained oil stains, small cuts from handling wire and metal, and most significantly traces of white chalk, dust around his fingernails and in the creases of his palms. Standard practice, he explained somewhat defensively when Slack pointed this out. Any electrician worth his salt marks his cable lengths, prevents errors, and ensures proper installation. And you helped carry the money earlier in the evening? Miss Marple inquired gently. Mrs. Bantry asked me to assist when they were transferring the takings to the counting hut, Denby admitted. Heavy bag of coins it was, needed 2 people to manage it properly. Mrs. Bantry, when consulted, confirmed this account with some embarrassment. I should have mentioned it earlier, Inspector. Hugh was most helpful when we were setting up the counting arrangements. Such a heavy purse, and Mrs. Rowe isn't as young as she once was. However, it was the timing of this assistance that proved most interesting. According to Mrs. Bantry's recollection, Denby had helped with the money transfer much earlier in the evening, well before the fatal events in the counting hut. It must have been around 6:30, she mused, just after the stalls opened for the evening trade. Hugh was checking the electrical connections then, making sure everything was working properly. Miss Marple found this timeline curious. So Mr. Denby's chalk prints on the purse were made sometime before Mr. Vale's death. That's right, Mrs. Bantry confirmed. Though now that I think about it, Hugh did mention something about needing to check the money arrangements later in the evening. Something about the security of the hut. This revelation prompted Slack to delve deeper into the events of the evening, and what emerged painted a more complex picture of Denby's movements and opportunities. Colonel Bantry, when pressed for more details about his own activities, recalled sending Denby to investigate a problem with the southern string of lights around 7:30. There was a flicker in the display, the colonel explained, quite noticeable and potentially dangerous if there was a short circuit developing. I asked Denby to have a look, naturally, given his expertise. And did he resolve the problem? Slack inquired. Seemed to. The lights were steady when he returned, though he did mutter something about finding a man in a Santa hood interfering with the equipment. Colonel Bantry's mustache bristled with indignation. Said he'd had to redirect some cables to ensure proper function. Miss Marple exchanged a meaningful glance with Inspector Slack. The timing of this electrical work coincided precisely with the period when the mysterious second Father Christmas had been observed near the generator. Mr. Denby returned from this electrical work at what time? She asked. Oh, shortly before the choir began their first carol. 7:40 or thereabouts, Colonel Bantry replied. I remember because he commented on the quality of the singing as he passed. When confronted with this timeline, Denby's explanations became increasingly strained. He admitted to having been near the generator during the crucial period, but insisted his presence there was entirely professional. The southern lights were drawing too much power, he claimed. Had to adjust the load distribution to prevent an ESI overload. Standard maintenance procedure. However, Inspector Slack's examination of the hired Santa suit bag yielded evidence that cast doubt on this purely technical explanation. Hidden among the costume accessories, wrapped in a piece of canvas, was a spare cuff and beard that showed distinct signs of having been worn recently. Most damning was the presence of soot around the cuff's edge and the unmistakable scent of petrol that clung to the fabric. When confronted with these items, Denby's composure finally began to crack. I found those in the bag, he said, his voice lacking conviction. Someone else must have put them there. Someone else who happened to have access to your tool storage, your electrical expertise, and your detailed knowledge of the market's layout. Miss Marple's tone remained gentle, but her words carried unmistakable implications. The evidence was mounting systematically. The chalk prints on the money purse established Denby's access to the hut and its contents. The timing of his electrical work placed him near the generator during the crucial period. The Psy costume pieces suggested his use of the Father Christmas disguise to conceal his activities. Yet there remained the question of motive. Why would Hugh Denby, a respected tradesman with a solid wartime record, risk everything to murder Crispin Vale? It was Mrs. Bantry who inadvertently provided the first hint when she mentioned Vale's business interests. Such a successful man, Mr. Vale. Always investigating new opportunities, he said. Quite the entrepreneur. What sort of opportunities? Miss Marple inquired with apparent casualness. Oh, property development mainly. But he mentioned having looked into various local businesses as well. Said he liked to understand the full economic picture of any area before making investments. Mrs. Bantry's expression grew thoughtful. Come to think of it, he did ask rather pointed questions about our electrical contractor. Wanted to know about licensing, supplier relationships, that sort of thing. The implications were becoming clearer. Vale's business acumen and tendency to investigate thoroughly before investing might have uncovered something about Denby's operations that the electrician preferred to keep hidden. Miss Marple reflected on what she knew of post-war conditions, the shortages that made certain commodities particularly valuable, and the opportunities such circumstances might create for those with access to official supplies and equipment. Inspector, she said quietly, I believe it might be worth examining Mr. Denby's business records rather carefully, particularly his supply purchases and any sales of surplus equipment. The suggestion proved prescient. When Slack obtained the necessary warrants and examined Denby's accounts, a pattern emerged that explained both the motive for murder and the elaborate method chosen to achieve it. The chalk on the purse had been more than just evidence of handling money. It had been the mark of a man whose careful planning was beginning to unravel under the scrutiny of someone far too perceptive for his own good. Chapter 7. Midnight by the Generator. Miss Marple's suggestion that they observe the village green under cover of darkness proved to be one of her more inspired ideas. Inspector Slack, though initially skeptical about the value of such surveillance, agreed to the experiment after considering the mounting evidence against Hugh Denby. If he's as methodical as he appears, Miss Marple reasoned quietly, he may well return to ensure that all traces of his activities have been properly concealed. Guilty consciences, I find, often compel people to revisit the scenes of their crimes, and so it was that shortly before midnight on the fourth day after the Christmas market, Miss Marple and Sergeant Lake found themselves positioned behind the memorial cross, watching the darkened green with patient attention. The fairy light brackets stood bare against the winter sky, and the generator sat silent, where it had been moved for the investigation. They had not long to wait. At precisely 11:55, a figure emerged from the shadows near the Gossington Hall gates. Even in the dim moonlight, the compact, efficient movements were unmistakably those of Hugh Denby. He carried what appeared to be a coil of rubber tubing and moved with the purposeful stride of a man who knew exactly what he intended to accomplish. Sergeant Lake tensed beside Miss Marple, but she placed a restraining hand on his arm. "Let's see what he does," she whispered. "Evidence of intent may prove as valuable as evidence of past actions." Denby approached the generator with obvious familiarity, checking connections and adjusting components with practiced efficiency. From his pocket, he produced what looked like red ribbon, and Miss Marple noted how he handled it with the same methodical care he applied to his electrical equipment. It was when he began arranging the rubber tubing in a specific pattern near the generators, exhaust, that Sergeant Lake moved into action. "Hugh Denby," he called out firmly. "I'd like a word with you, if you please." Denby spun around startled, and in his haste to conceal what he was doing, he dropped several items. The rubber tubing fell to the ground with a soft thud, followed by the red ribbon and something that clinked metallically against the frozen earth. "Sergeant Lake," Denby managed, attempting to regain his composure. "Working rather late, aren't you? Might say the same about you, Mr. Denby. What brings you out here at this hour?" Miss Marple emerged from behind the memorial cross, and Denby's face went noticeably pale in the moonlight. "Miss Marple, I didn't expect. That is, I was just checking on some equipment." "At midnight?" Sergeant Lake inquired skeptically. "Seems an odd time for routine maintenance." Denby's explanation was as unconvincing as it was hastily constructed. "Couldn't sleep, you see. Kept thinking about potential hazards. These generators can be dangerous if not properly maintained, and with children about during the day." But his words trailed off as Sergeant Lake began collecting the items he had dropped. The rubber tubing was identical to the piece they had found earlier, and the red ribbon matched the fragments discovered in the counting hut's ash bin. Most interesting of all was a small metal object that proved to be a ticket stub. But his words trailed off as Sergeant Lake began collecting the items he had dropped. The rubber tubing was identical to the piece they had found earlier, and the red ribbon matched the fragments discovered in the counting hut's ash bin. Most interesting of all was a small metal object that proved to be a ticket stub. "Now that's curious," Miss Marple observed, examining the ticket by the light of Sergeant Lake's torch. "One of the raffle tickets from the Christmas market. And unless I'm very much mistaken, it's from the sequence that went missing from Miss Finch's records." Denby's face had gone from pale to ashen. "I can explain that. Found it blowing about in the wind. Thought someone might want it back." "A torn ticket, Mr. Denby." Miss Marple's gentle tone made the observation all the more pointed. "And folded quite carefully, I notice. Almost as though it had been in someone's pocket for some time." Sergeant Lake continued his examination of Denby's pockets, producing additional evidence that made the electrician's situation increasingly precarious. Among the items was a church bell shilling, the old-fashioned coin that several of the stall holders had mentioned receiving during the evening's transactions. "Interesting coin," Miss Marple noted. "Rather unusual to see one of those in general circulation these days. I believe Mrs. Henderson mentioned receiving one at her mulled wine stall. Said the customer claimed it was from Peter Nash helping with the cords." "There's no Peter Nash in St. Mary Mead," Sergeant Lake observed grimly. The discovery of these items in Denby's possession provided the final links in the chain of evidence that had been building over the past several days. The rubber tubing confirmed his access to the materials needed for the murder method. The red ribbon connected him to the decorative elements used to conceal the crime. The ticket stub established his presence at key locations during the crucial timing, and the church bell shilling revealed his deception about other people's involvement. But it was what they found in Denby's toolbox that provided the most damning evidence of all. Hidden beneath his normal electrical equipment was a wire-twisting tool flecked with holly resin and a scrap of artificial fur that matched the Father Christmas costume. "Just tidying hazards," Denby said weakly when confronted with these items, "and testing a trick for the fireworks man tomorrow." Miss Marple exchanged a glance with Sergeant Lake. "There are no fireworks planned for tomorrow, Mr. Denby. The Christmas market was a single evening event." The weight of accumulated evidence was finally too much for Denby's composure. His shoulders sagged, and for a moment he looked far older than his years. "It wasn't supposed to happen like that," he said quietly. "It was meant to be a warning, nothing more, to scare him into keeping quiet." "About what, Mr. Denby?" Miss Marple's voice carried that particular gentleness she reserved for moments when the truth was finally emerging. "The supplies, the petrol, the generators, the electrical equipment." Denby's words came haltingly, as though each admission was being dragged from him against his will. There were so many surplus materials after the war, equipment that wasn't needed anymore. I thought no. One would miss a bit here and there. The picture that emerged was of a man who had started small, perhaps taking only what he needed for legitimate work, but had gradually expanded his operations until he was running a significant black market business in electrical supplies and fuel. "Vale found out," Sergeant Lake prompted. "He was investigating local businesses, looking for investment opportunities, started asking questions about my suppliers, wanted to see purchase orders and delivery receipts." Denby's voice grew bitter. threatened to expose everything unless I cut him in for a share of the profits. So you decided to silence him permanently, Miss Marple observed sadly. It was supposed to be just a scare, Denby repeated. Lock him in the hut with a bit of exhaust fumes. Make him think twice about his threats. But the door, he must have locked it from inside. And by the time I realized... Doors don't lock against breath, Mr. Denby, Miss Marple said gently. And holly wreaths don't grow over vents by themselves. The midnight encounter had revealed not only Denby's guilt, but also his continuing attempts to cover his tracks. His return to the scene demonstrated the kind of methodical thinking that had made his original plan so nearly successful, but also the nervousness that had ultimately led to his downfall. As Sergeant Lake placed Denby under arrest, Miss Marple reflected on how the man's very competence had become his undoing. The careful planning, the technical expertise, the attention to detail that had served him well in his legitimate work had created a trail of evidence that a thorough investigation could follow. The fairy lights were dark, but in Miss Marple's mind she could see them again as they had been that festive evening, twinkling innocently while beneath their cheerful glow, desperation and greed had led a man to commit the most final of crimes. Chapter 8. Burnt. Chapter 8. Burnt Ribbon. The morning following Hugh Denby's arrest brought with it a renewed sense of purpose to the investigation. Inspector Slack, emboldened by the previous night's success, was determined to complete the case with the same thoroughness that had brought them to this point. Miss Marple, meanwhile, found herself drawn once again to the physical evidence, convinced that there were still details to be uncovered that would illuminate the full scope of Denby's carefully planned crime. It was this attention to seemingly minor details that led her to make a discovery that would prove crucial to understanding the complete method of murder. While Inspector Slack was occupied with the formal charging procedures, Miss Marple returned to the counting hut area with a sieve borrowed from Mrs. Bantry's kitchen. The ash bin that had contained the brazier's cold remains had been emptied and examined, but Miss Marple suspected that not all of its secrets had been revealed. Working with patient determination, she sifted through the ashes that had been scattered, near where the bin had stood. Her persistence was rewarded when the sieve revealed several charred fragments of red ribbon, stiffened with what appeared to be shellac. The pieces were small but unmistakably identifiable as remnants of the same type of ribbon that B. Lutal used for her Christmas decorations. Most interesting, she murmured to herself, examining the fragments closely. The ribbon ends are burnt, but still retain their characteristic stiffness, and she could see where they had been cut cleanly before being consigned to the flames. Dr. Haydock, arriving to complete his final examination of the scene, found Miss Marple absorbed in this meticulous work. Found something significant? He inquired, settling his medical bag down and joining her examination. I believe so, Doctor. These ribbon fragments were clearly burned after being cut from a larger piece, and see how they retain their shape even after burning. That's the effect of the shellac treatment that Miss Lutal uses to stiffen her decorative ribbons. The same type she gave to the mysterious Father Christmas? He asked immediately, grasping the significance. Precisely, which suggests that whoever requested that ribbon used it for its intended purpose, and then destroyed the evidence. Miss Marple continued her careful sifting. But there's something else here as well. Among the ribbon fragments was a small cone of paper, also charred but still partially intact. The paper showed clear signs of having been exposed to exhaust fumes with a sooty residue that had survived the flames. A funnel of sorts, Dr. Haydock observed, examining the paper cone. Used to direct something, perhaps, or to concentrate. Miss Marple suggested thoughtfully. If were attempting to direct exhaust fumes through a narrow opening, a paper funnel might prove quite useful for ensuring an efficient connection. This discovery prompted a return visit to Mabel Finch's stall area, where a themethodical stationer had been cleaning up the debris from the Christmas market. Miss Marple's request to examine their fuse had initially puzzled Mabel, but she was happy to cooperate with the investigation. I always keep things tidy, Mabel explained, producing a small box of discarded materials. Never know when something might prove useful later. Among the contents of Mabel's refuse box, Miss Marple found exactly what she was looking for. A ticket, stub from the missing number pair, one that bore traces of grease and what appeared to be petroleum residue. Now that's curious, Mabel admitted when Miss Marple showed her the discovery. I don't remember any of my tickets getting that dirty during the sales process. My hands were quite clean throughout the evening. The grease on the ticket stub matched the type that would naturally accumulate on the hands of someone working extensively with mechanical equipment, particularly generators and fuel systems. Combined with the petroleum residue, it provided yet another link between Denby and the crime scene evidence. Dr. Haydock's final medical examination of the case provided the official confirmation of what the accumulated evidence had already suggested. Carbon monoxide poisoning, he announced definitively. The rosy coloration of the skin, the bright appearance of the lips, the apparent lack of struggle, all consistent with exposure to concentrated exhaust fumes. The brazier was merely a deception. Then, Inspector Slack inquired. Complete deception, Haydock confirmed. The brazier had been allowed to go cold well before death occurred. The actual source of the deadly gas came from elsewhere entirely, Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. The paper cone would have been essential for creating an efficient connection between the rubber tubing and the vent opening. The ribbon would have been used to secure the arrangement and perhaps to mark the proper positioning, and both were destroyed immediately afterward to eliminate evidence of the method. The systematic destruction of evidence revealed the killer's continuing attention to detail even after the crime had been committed. Denby had not simply relied on the apparent naturalness of Vale's death. He had actively worked to eliminate any traces that might point to the true method of murder. The timing would have been crucial, Miss Marple observed. He would have needed to connect the tubing, activate the gas flow, wait for the victim to succumb, and then remove all evidence before Mrs. Rowe returned from her errand. Inspector Slack consulted his notes. Mrs. Rowe was absent from the hut for approximately 10 minutes. Would that have been sufficient? More than sufficient for someone who had planned every detail in advance, Miss Marple replied. And the choir's carol would have provided perfect cover for any sounds associated with the setup or removal of the equipment. The choir's performance of Person and Hodie had lasted precisely the right length of time to allow Denby to complete his deadly work. The choice of timing suggested not only careful planning, but also intimate knowledge of the market's routines and the predictable behavior of its participants. When confronted with this additional evidence, Denby's remaining defense crumbled entirely. The burnt ribbon fragments, the paper cone, the greasy ticket stub, all combined to create an irrefutable picture of premeditated murder carried out with technical precision. The ribbon was supposed to burn completely, he admitted finally, and the paper cone should have been destroyed in the brazier along with everything else. But there wasn't time to ensure complete destruction before Mrs. Rowe returned. Miss Marple found this confession both satisfying and deeply sad. The methodical mind that had planned such an elaborate crime was the same one that had served his community faithfully 4 years. But greed and the fear of exposure had corrupted those very qualities that had made him valuable. The cherry-colored skin that Dr. Haydock observed, she explained to Inspector Slack later, was the telltale sign of carbon monoxide poisoning. Poor Mr. Vale would have lost consciousness very quickly with no opportunity to call for help or struggle against his fate. The case was essentially complete now with motive, method, and opportunity all clearly established. But Miss Marple knew that there remained one final chapter to be written, one that would reveal the full scope of Denby's deception and bring closure to the community that had been so shaken by these events. The burnt ribbon had told its story, joining the constellation of evidence that illuminated a crime as complex as it was heartless. In destroying the evidence of his method, Denby had inadvertently created new evidence of his guilt, an irony that Miss Marple found sadly appropriate to the entire tragic affair. Chapter 9. Chapter 9. Wrong generosity, wrong generosity. The fifth morning of the investigation brought with it the final pieces of the puzzle that had so tragically disrupted St. Mary, Mead's Christmas market. Inspector Slack had spent the early hours examining Hugh Denby's business records with the thoroughness that the case demanded, and what he discovered painted a picture of systematic fraud that went far beyond simple wartime opportunism. Miss Marple arrived at the village hall to find Slack surrounded by ledgers, receipts, and correspondence that told the story of Denby's gradual descent from honest tradesman to criminal entrepreneur. "It's all here," Slack announced grimly. Years of false invoices, diverted supplies, and equipment sales that never appeared in any official records. The man was running a complete parallel business using materials that should have gone to legitimate reconstruction efforts. The scope of Denby's operations was impressive in its audacity. He had systematically diverted petrol from official allocations, sold generators and electrical equipment that had been obtained through government surplus programs, and created an elaborate network of false documentation to cover his tracks. The irony, Miss Marple observed, examining one of the forged receipts, is that his very competence made the fraud possible. His reputation for reliability gave him access to materials and contracts that a less trusted individual could never have obtained. Most damaging of all was a series of letters that revealed the true relationship between Denby and Crispin Vale. Far from being the casual acquaintance that Denby had portrayed, Vale had been conducting a detailed investigation into local business practices as part of his investment research. Vale wasn't just making idle threats, Slack explained, holding up one particularly incriminating document. He had documented evidence of Denby's entire operation: serial numbers, delivery dates, discrepancies in official records. The man was thorough. Vale's final letter to Denby, dated just days before the Christmas market, made his intentions crystal clear. Unless Denby agreed to make him a full partner in the illegal enterprise, Vale would expose the entire operation to the authorities. "Wrong generosity indeed," Miss Marple murmured, reading the letter. Mr. Vale's charitable pledge to match the market's takings was never intended as genuine philanthropy. It was a way of publicly establishing his financial credibility, while privately pressing Mr. Denby into submission. The psychological pressure on Denby became clear as they pieced together the timeline of events. Vale's very public announcement of his generous matching donation had been calculated to demonstrate his financial power and social standing, making his threats all the more credible. Denby must have realized that exposure would mean not just criminal charges but complete social ruin, Miss Marple reflected. His reputation in the community, his livelihood, his entire identity as a reliable tradesman, all would have been destroyed. The method of murder, when viewed in this context, revealed itself as the product of desperate calculation. Denby used his technical expertise to create a killing method that would appear natural, while eliminating the one person who could destroy him. The generator exhaust, the rubber tubing, the holly wreath to conceal the entry point, Slack enumerated. Every element chosen for its technical effectiveness and its ability to be quickly concealed. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. And the Father Christmas disguise provided the perfect cover for his activities near the generator. Children expect to see Santa everywhere during such celebrations, and adults tend not to look too closely at someone in costume. The false alibi had been carefully constructed through misdirection and timing. By appearing as the mysterious second Father Christmas during the crucial minutes, Denby had created witnesses to his presence near the generator while simultaneously providing an explanation for anyone who might question his activities there. The left-to-right wire twisting on the holly wreath was his signature, Miss Marple observed, a professional habit so ingrained that he couldn't suppress it, even when creating evidence that might incriminate him. The planning revealed in Denby's actions was both meticulous and chilling. He had anticipated Mrs. Rowe's routine of fetching change during the choir's opening carol, timed his actions to coincide with the musical cover, and prepared every element of his murder method in advance. The chalk marks we found weren't random, Slack realized, examining the site photographs again. He had measured and marked the exact positioning needed for his tubing arrangement during his earlier electrical work. Most telling of all was the evidence of Denby's financial desperation revealed in the missing ticket numbers and the chalk prints on the money purse. His illegal operations had apparently left him short of ready cash, forcing him to supplement his income through petty theft from the very charitable fund he was helping to organize. The missing ticket stubs and the greasy butt show he was dipping into the takings while preparing his murder scene, Miss Marple explained, probably needed change for some aspect of his plan, or simply couldn't resist the opportunity for additional profit. When confronted with this complete picture of his crimes, Denby's remaining resistance collapsed entirely. In his final confession, he revealed the depth of his desperation and the twisted logic that had led him to murder. Vale had everything documented, he admitted bitterly. Every delivery, every sale, every false receipt. He showed me photographs of my storage shed, copies of official orders that didn't match my inventory. The man was like a terrier with a rat. So you decided to eliminate him rather than share your profits? Inspector Slack asked. It wasn't about the money by then, Denby replied, his voice hollow with defeat. It was about survival. Prison, disgrace, the buy, loss of everything I'd built. I thought if I could make it look like natural causes, like heart failure, brought on by the cold and excitement. But you locked him in with the gas, Miss Marple observed gently. The door mechanism was supposed to be fail-safe, Denby protested. He should have been able to get out when he felt unwell. It was meant to be a warning, a demonstration of what could happen if he pushed too hard. Doors don't lock against breath, Mr. Denby, Miss Marple repeated her earlier observation, and a man planning merely to frighten doesn't destroy evidence so thoroughly afterward. The full confession revealed a crime that had been planned with cold deliberation, executed with technical precision, and covered up with systematic destruction of evidence. Denby's protestations about intending merely to warn Vale rang hollow against the weight of his elaborate preparations. As Inspector Slack concluded the formal charging procedures, Miss Marple reflected on the tragedy that had unfolded. A man's reputation for reliability and competence had become the very tools of his downfall, corrupted by greed and transformed into instruments of murder. The wrong generosity that had begun with wartime opportunism had escalated through systematic fraud, to culminate in the ultimate crime. In trying to preserve his ill-gotten gains, Hugh Denby had lost not only his freedom but his soul, becoming the very opposite of the trusted craftsman he'd once been. Tomorrow would bring the final revelation when all the participants in that fatal evening would gather to hear the complete solution to a mystery that had shaken their quiet community to its foundations. Chapter 10. Market Revealed. The final gathering took place on a gray Chapter 10. Market revealed December morning in the very counting hut where Crispin Vale had met his end. Inspector Slack had arranged for Thesmall Building to be returned to its original position, and now it served as the setting for Miss Marple's systematic revelation of how a Christmas market celebration had been transformed into the scene of an ingeniously planned murder. Those present represented all the principal figures in the tragedy, Mrs. Bantry and Colonel Bantry, their faces grave with the weight of recent events. Inspector Slack with his notebook at the ready. Dr. Haydock, who had confirmed the medical details, the Reverend Clement and his wife, representing the moral conscience of the community, Mabel Finch, still clutching her ledgers with characteristic precision. Mrs. Rowe, whose accounting had proved so crucial to the investigation. B. Lutal, whose ribbons had played their part in the deadly scheme. Toby Price, whose Father Christmas costume had provided cover for deception, and Hugh Denby himself, flanked by constables and wearing the defeated expression of a man whose carefully constructed world had collapsed entirely. Miss Marple stood quietly, beside the small table where the evidence had been arranged, her gentle demeanor belying the steel-trap mind that had unraveled one of the most complex murder plots she had ever encountered. The method, she began in her soft, clear voice, was as ingenious as it was heartless. Mr. Denby used his technical expertise to create what appeared to be death from natural causes, while actually committing deliberate murder through carbon monoxide, poisoning. She gestured toward the rubber tubing that had been displayed as evidence. The generator's exhaust was directed through this tubing into the counting hut's louver vent. The holly wreath, so festively decorative, served to conceal the entry point and anchor the tubing in place. Dr. Haydock nodded gravely. The symptoms Mr. Vale displayed, the rosy coloration and bright lips, were classic signs of carbon monoxide poisoning. Death would have occurred within minutes of exposure to concentrated fumes. But the timing was crucial, Miss Marple continued. Mr. Denby needed to know precisely when Mr. Vale would be alone in the hut, and for how long. This knowledge came from his intimate familiarity with the market's routines and Mrs. Rowe's predictable habits. Mrs. Rowe shifted uncomfortably in her chair. I always fetch change when the choir begins their first carol. It's become something of a tradition, but I never imagined. Of course not, my dear, Miss Marple assured her gently. Your reliability made you an unknowing accomplice to Mr. Denby's scheme. He counted on your stepping out at precisely 7:40, just as the choir's performance would provide acoustic cover for his activities. She turned to address the paper cone and burnt ribbon fragments that lay among the evidence. These items reveal the mechanical precision of the murder method. The paper cone served as a funnel to ensure efficient connection between the tubing and the vent opening. The red ribbon obtained from Miss Ludel under the pretense of decorating was used to secure and position the arrangement. B. Lutal spoke, appositely. The person who asked for the ribbon, he was wearing a Father Christmas costume. I never suspected. Which brings us to the matter of alibi staging, Miss Marple observed. Mr. Denby's disguise as the mysterious second Father Christmas was perhaps the most clever aspect of his plan. Children naturally expect to see Santa everywhere during such celebrations, and adults tend not to examine costume figures too closely. She indicated the spare costume pieces that had been recovered. The Cycuff sand beard, borrowed from the Dramatic Society supplies, allowed Mr. Denby to be observed near the generator during the crucial period, while maintaining the fiction that he was merely helping with decorations or electrical maintenance. Toby Price's glittered beard provided the perfect contrast, Miss Marple explained. The authentic Father Christmas had remained steadfastly in his grotto, his beard heavy with artificial snow that proved he had never left his post to engage in more sinister activities. The timing of the murder was masked by the choir's performance at 7:45, she continued. The very moment when their voices rose in celebration became the moment when Mr. Vale drew his last breath. The cold brazier in the corner was mere misdirection designed to suggest an accident with heating equipment. Inspector Slack consulted his notes, and the window was cracked open to dissipate the gas and confuse the investigation. Precisely. Every detail was calculated to create the appearance of tragic accident or natural death. Miss Marple's voice carried a note of sadness, but the very thoroughness of the planning created evidence that careful investigation could uncover. She turned to the chalk prints on the money purse and the missing ticket numbers. These seemingly minor details revealed both Mr. Denby's access to the crime scene and his financial desperation. The black market operation that provided his motive also drove him to petty theft from the very charitable fund he was helping to organize. The full scope of Denby's criminal enterprise had emerged through Inspector Slack's investigation of his business records. Years of systematic fraud involving diverted government supplies and falsified documentation had created a profitable but illegal operation that Crispin Vale had discovered and threatened to expose. Mr. Vale's generous offer to match the evening's takings was never intended as philanthropy, Miss Marple explained. It was a public demonstration of his financial power designed to pressure Mr. Denby into accepting him as a partner in the illegal enterprise. When Denby finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. It was only supposed to scare him into reasonable terms. The door had a simple latch. He could have gotten out when he felt unwell. I never intended for him to die. Doors don't lock against breath, Mr. Denby, Miss Marple replied gently but firmly, And holly wreaths don't grow over vents by themselves. Your actions that evening were those of a man committed to permanent solution, not temporary warning. The evidence of premeditation was overwhelming. The carefully measured positioning marked with chalk, the systematic destruction of incriminating materials, the elaborate alibi created through costume and timing. Each element revealed a mind that had planned not mere intimidation, but murder. As Inspector Slack formally concluded the case, Mrs. Bantry rose to address the practical aftermath. The raffle proceeds, augmented by the seizure of Denby's illegal profits, would indeed benefit the hospital fund as originally intended. The community would heal from this violation of its trust, but the memory of how festive celebration had been corrupted by greed would linger. Snow began to fall again as the gathering dispersed. Soft flakes that reminded Miss Marple of that earlier evening when fairy lights had twinkled innocently while murder was being planned and executed. Mrs. Bantry walked beside her, linking their arms in a gesture of mutual support. "I do so hate wickedness done in fairy lights," Mrs. Bantry murmured, echoing her earlier sentiment. Miss Marple smiled gently, though her eyes remained thoughtful. "And I as well, my dear Dolly, but fairy lights are honest things when all is said and done. If you follow the wires properly, they lead you to the truth, however unpleasant that truth might be." The Christmas market mystery was solved. Justice would be served, but the cost in human terms would be felt by St. Mary Mead for a long time to come. In trying to preserve his ill-gotten gains, Hugh Denby had lost everything that truly mattered, including his soul.